The hearing room feels less like a chamber of government and more like a stage suspended in quiet electricity. Fluorescent light glints off polished wood and silver microphones. Every movement echoes, the shuffle of papers, the faint cough from the gallery, the mechanical blink of cameras capturing history in real time. At the center sit two figures drawn from different worlds of justice. Representative Jasmine Crockett, young but seasoned in moral discipline, keeps her posture composed, her eyes steady as flint. Across from her, Alan Dershowitz, the veteran scholar, carries decades of legal muscle in his voice and the certainty of precedent in his expression. When the chairman yields the floor, the silence itself seems to lean forward. Dershowitz begins with the confidence of one who has defined arguments for generations. Crockett listens not to rebut, but to reveal. Every nod is calculation, every pause a prelude. The air tightens as intellect meets conscience, principle meets pride. Then, without warning, she draws a breath that stills even the scribbling of reporters. Her voice cuts through the hush, calm, precise, impossible to ignore. One question hangs poised on her lips, and before it lands, the whole room knows everything is about to change. If moments like this remind you that integrity is still the heartbeat of democracy, stay with us. Subscribe, share, and lend your voice to stories where truth speaks calmly and power listens. Because when courage meets civility and reason rises above noise, the public conscience breathes again. For the first 20 minutes, the hearing unfolded with the precision of a chess match played in public view. Alan Dershowitz, confident and measured, invoked precedent after precedent, drawing from the deep reservoir of constitutional logic that had made his name synonymous with courtroom intellect. Each citation carried the weight of history. Marbury, Gideon, Miranda, spoken like ritual incantations that reaffirmed his mastery of the system. His voice filled the room, steady, professorial, the cadence of someone accustomed to defining the terms of argument before anyone else could. Across from him, Representative Jasmine Crockett appeared still, yet her stillness was its own kind of movement. She listened as though absorbing not just words but intention. Her pen hovered occasionally, marking notes, yet her eyes never left him. The contrast between them was striking. The veteran and the newcomer, the theorist and the practitioner, the scholar who had built a life in defense of abstract justice, and the lawmaker who had witnessed how abstract justice collapses under lived inequity. Camera angles told their own story, the occasional close-up catching the micro-expressions that words couldn't hide. Dershowitz gestured expansively, hands slicing through the air, the rhythm of authority. Crockett leaned forward just slightly, elbows resting on the desk, chin poised above clasped hands. She was listening, but more than that, she was preparing. Commentators watching the live stream began to catch it too. The early headlines forming on social media were not about confrontation, but about composition. She's not debating, she's building. Gradually, the rhythm of the exchange began to tighten. What started as a polite academic dialogue transformed into a test of definitions, a duel fought not with anger, but with language itself. Crockett's tone was calm, almost surgical, as she asked, "What does accountability mean if it protects only the powerful?" The question landed softly, but it carried a quiet weight that lingered. Dershowitz, unflustered, countered with text. "The Constitution protects process, not outcomes." To an ordinary ear, it sounded like another tidy exchange, but to anyone who understood the undercurrent, the tension was building. Each answer opened a door, each question closed it tighter. The air thickened, not with hostility, but with significance. Viewers could sense that something deeper than argument was unfolding. This wasn't about proving who was right. It was about revealing what was missing. Meanwhile, the digital world began to stir. Short clips from the live stream surfaced across platforms, the captions swelling with fascination. Crockett is dissecting Dershowitz line by line. Yet inside the room there was no grandstanding. The performance was entirely untheatrical. Two disciplined minds circling an invisible moral center. Crockett's next question sliced through the rhythm. If the law allows injustice through procedure, does that still make it just? It was a simple sentence, but its precision carried years of frustration compressed into one ethical paradox. The sentence hung in the air longer than any that had come before it. Dershowitz paused, not long enough for it to seem like hesitation, but long enough for the cameras to register it. The silence between question and answer became the heartbeat of the room. He responded carefully, as though aware that this was not merely a question of legal theory, but of conscience. Justice, he said, cannot depend on perception. The law must stand even when the public disagrees. It was a respectable answer, firm, elegant, almost rehearsed. But something in his tone had changed. He had gone from asserting to defending, from leading to reacting. Crockett nodded once, letting the silence linger. "Of course," she replied quietly. "But whose disagreement decides when the law stops listening?" It wasn't defiance, it was discipline. And the brilliance of her method lay in how little she revealed of her strategy. She didn't interrupt, didn't challenge the man's credentials, didn't lean into spectacle. She simply held space for contradiction until it exposed itself. Across the hearing room, subtle things began to shift. The quiet glances between staffers, the slowing of note-taking, the sense that the room itself had started to side with curiosity rather than authority. There was no applause, no visible reaction, yet the collective attention tilted toward her. It was as if, somewhere between decorum and dialogue, the hearing had turned into something much rarer, a genuine search for meaning. For Dershowitz, every principle he invoked seemed to circle back to the same defense, the sanctity of process. For Crockett, every question seemed to circle the same doubt, the sanctity of justice when process forgets people. Two languages, both fluent, both lawful, but one carrying a pulse, the other lacked. The tension was not explosive, it was cumulative. Each moment folded quietly into the next, until what had begun as a textbook exchange had become something alive, almost cinematic. The light seemed harsher, the air more fragile. Dershowitz continued to speak, yet every sentence now felt like a step backward toward safer ground. Crockett didn't press. She waited. The patience itself was the pressure. When the chairman called for a brief procedural pause, the audience exhaled as if waking from a trance. No one clapped, but eyes met across the room, a silent acknowledgement that they had just witnessed something shifting. And as the murmurs rose and aides shuffled papers, Crockett leaned back slightly, her face unreadable, but her purpose clear. The first half of the match was over, but the game had changed. Dershowitz glanced in her direction, perhaps sensing it too, that she had drawn him away from the fortress of precedent into the open field of principle, where logic must face morality without the armor of abstraction. And though no one yet knew where she was leading him, everyone could feel it. The next question would not be about law at all. It would be about truth. The exchange that followed unfolded like an orchestral crescendo. Each word, each pause, another instrument in a symphony of tension. The civility remained intact, but beneath the politeness, the moral temperature began to rise. Alan Dershowitz leaned into his microphone, his tone even and instructive. He spoke of law as the spine of civilization, something meant to stand firm against emotion, passion, and the dangers of political whim. The integrity of constitutional defense, he said, must transcend emotion, even when that defense shields unpopular causes. Justice is not about who we sympathize with, but about who the law protects equally. Crockett nodded slowly, the gesture more acknowledgement than agreement. "I understand that principle, Professor," she said, her tone low and deliberate. "But doesn't that consistency sometimes serve inequality? When the same framework you defend is used to preserve imbalance, does it still serve justice, or does it simply maintain order?" He smiled, that polite academic smile that deflects confrontation while buying time. "Consistency," he replied, "is what keeps justice impartial. The moment we allow empathy to outweigh consistency, we risk weaponizing law to satisfy outrage." Crockett smiled back, but her eyes carried the stillness of someone who'd already seen the flaw in that argument. "But empathy," she countered softly, "isn't the enemy of justice. It's the reason we have it." A murmur rippled through the room, faint but audible. The rhythm had changed. Where his confidence had earlier dominated, her poise now began to command attention. What followed wasn't loud or theatrical. It was meticulous. Through layered questioning, Crockett began to dismantle not the man, but the intellectual scaffolding he stood on. She cited data on prosecutorial bias and sentencing disparities. She quoted his own past writings, phrases from decades earlier where he had warned that the law, left unexamined, can harden into a system that protects itself rather than those it serves. The irony was surgical. She wasn't arguing against him. She was using his own wisdom as reflection. "Professor," she said, flipping through her notes, "in your book from 1985, you wrote that the role of the legal scholar is not only to interpret the law, but to remind society of its conscience. Do you still believe that?" He blinked once, perhaps caught between recollection and recognition. "Of course," he answered, "but conscience must always be tempered by rule." She leaned forward. "Tempered, yes, but not replaced." That line drew an imperceptible shift in the room's balance. The hearing wasn't about policy anymore. It had become a meditation on moral architecture. Dershowitz pressed on, his tone sharpening slightly. "The danger of moralizing the law," he said, "is that it becomes arbitrary, dictated by whoever claims moral superiority." "Law must remain neutral," Crockett responded without raising her voice. "Neutrality is only justice when both sides begin at the same place. Otherwise, it's privilege pretending to be balance." The words floated into the charged air, deliberate and exact. No one moved. Even the sound technician seemed frozen in stillness. "Professor," she continued after a pause, "when the law protects the letter but forgets the people, who speaks for justice then?" The question lingered, suspended between intellect and conscience. For the first time that morning, Dershowitz hesitated. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger but in calculation. It was the look of a man realizing that he was no longer defending a principle. He was defending its shadow. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Crockett's voice interjected, gentle but firm. "No, I'm not asking about law," she said. "I'm asking about responsibility." That word, responsibility, redefined the entire atmosphere. The room, already quiet, seemed to draw tighter around them. This was no longer the arena of constitutional theory. It was something deeper, almost confessional. He exhaled softly. "Responsibility is a broad word, Congresswoman," he said. "Lawyers, judges, and legislators all share it in different ways." "But when accountability fails," she replied, "whose conscience carries the cost?" It wasn't an accusation. It was an invitation. And that made it harder to dismiss. Dershowitz's reply came slower now. "I have always believed," he said, "that defending even the most controversial causes is itself an act of conscience. The rule of law cannot bend to emotion." Crockett nodded thoughtfully. "Then maybe conscience isn't about bending the law," she said. "Maybe it's about reminding the law who it's supposed to serve." For the first time, he didn't answer right away. The silence stretched. The audience, staffers, even the stenographer, all seemed suspended in the gravity of that pause. The air was thick, not with conflict, but with recognition. Crockett didn't press the silence. She let it live. The restraint itself was power. She had turned the confrontation into reflection. And reflection is where control changes hands. The rhythm of the conversation shifted completely. Dershowitz's sentences, once fluid and declarative, became more measured. He was choosing his words carefully now, his once dominant tone tempered by thought. It was the pivot, the moment that would later flood social media under captions like, "The moment control shifted." What made the moment extraordinary wasn't that she won the exchange, but that she transformed it. She changed the gravitational pull of the discussion from intellect to integrity. "Professor," she said at last, her voice a near whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room, "if defending the system means ignoring those it fails, is that still justice? Or just habit?" It landed like a gavel strike. Final, resonant, inescapable. The impact wasn't immediate applause or visible reaction. It was silence. The deep, stunned kind that feels sacred. Dershowitz's posture shifted slightly. His hands, once gesturing with authority, folded quietly before him. He inhaled, prepared to answer, but words seemed to elude him. When he did speak, it was softer than before. "That's a fair question," he said. Crockett didn't smile, didn't gloat. She simply nodded once, as though acknowledging not victory, but truth. The silence that followed held the moral weight of the entire hearing. Reporters scribbled furiously. Analysts exchanged glances. And online, the live stream comment sections exploded with timestamps. Go to 1:27:14. That's the moment. But inside the room, time felt slower. Crockett had managed what few do in political life. She had shifted the energy without raising her voice, guided the conversation without seizing it, and turned confrontation into conscience. Even Dershowitz seemed to recognize it. His expression softened, his tone, when he finally continued, was less defensive, more contemplative. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "the system needs reminders like this. Perhaps law does forget." That acknowledgement, small as it was, broke the tension like dawn breaking after a storm. It was neither surrender nor defeat. It was awareness, and awareness in that chamber was rare currency. The chairman cleared his throat to move the session forward, but the moment lingered like an echo that refused to fade. Crockett leaned back slightly, her notes untouched. Dershowitz glanced down at his papers, though he wasn't reading them. For the first time, they seemed not adversaries, but two participants in the same difficult truth, that justice, like democracy, must be constantly re-examined to stay alive. And as the cameras zoomed in for the final shot of that exchange, the audience could sense it. Something irreversible had shifted. It wasn't about who spoke louder or who appeared smarter. It was about who asked the question that made silence itself an answer. In that stillness, one truth crystallized. Integrity doesn't dominate. It transforms. The air in the chamber felt suspended. Like a held breath, Dershowitz's eyes flickered, searching for footing in a space that had suddenly shifted beneath him. His lips parted, the beginnings of an answer forming. But what emerged instead was hesitation, a visible fracture in the armor of certainty. It wasn't defeat. It was recognition. He blinked once, twice, as if recalibrating not his argument but his understanding. Around him, the hum of cameras softened, the shuffle of papers stilled. For the first time that morning, silence carried more weight than words. And in that silence, something irreversible occurred. The quiet transfer of moral authority. No one clapped. No one gasped. The shift was too sacred for spectacle. It was the kind of silence that only follows truth. Heavy, clear, undeniable. When he finally spoke, his tone had changed. The sharp edges of rhetoric had softened into something almost reflective. "That's a fair question," he said. A simple sentence. But the room felt it like a seismic tremor. Crockett didn't smile, didn't claim victory. She simply nodded once. An acknowledgement, not of triumph, but of connection. Her stillness said what words could not. That power isn't always taken, sometimes it's simply revealed for what it is. Every camera angle told the same story. Dershowitz, the seasoned legal mind, sat slightly back in his chair, hands folded. Crockett, poised and steady, looked forward, not at him, but through the moment itself. The visual symmetry was striking. Old power meeting, new purpose. The exchange had lasted less than a minute, yet within that span, decades of legal hierarchy had quietly inverted. By the time the chairman's gavel resumed the proceedings, something intangible had settled over the room. Respect, maybe, or realization. Crockett flipped her notebook closed, pen resting atop it, while Dershowitz glanced down at his papers without reading. The conversation had ended, but the echo remained. Minutes later, outside the chamber, phones buzzed. Editors clipped the exchange, pundits replayed it in slow motion, and captions began to flood the internet. Jasmine Crockett silences Alan Dershowitz with one powerful question. The pause that spoke louder than words. Yet those who had been in the room knew it wasn't about silence in the sense of speechlessness. It was silence as recognition. Truth spoken plainly had made argument unnecessary. Across social media, the clip began to loop endlessly. 10 seconds, her question, his pause, her calm. Millions watched the same sequence. dissecting micro-expressions. The tightening of his jaw, the steadiness of her gaze, the faint, almost imperceptible nod that followed his concession. Commentators called it the moment power blinked. What struck people wasn't her aggression. There was none. It was her composure, her refusal to chase validation. She didn't celebrate, she didn't perform. She let the truth breathe on its own. And in doing so, she modeled a kind of strength politics rarely rewards, the strength to hold silence without surrendering message. Back in the hallway, a reporter caught her briefly before she left. "Congresswoman," he asked, "did you expect that reaction?" She smiled faintly. "No," she said, "but I expected honesty to find its way through." That single line would accompany every replay of the viral moment, quoted in headlines and captions, as if it were the moral thesis of the exchange. By evening, think pieces began to appear. When calm defeated certainty. The art of political grace. How one question redefined power. And yet beyond the noise of commentary, the essence remained beautifully simple. A woman stood her ground, asked a question, and held space long enough for the truth to arrive. Inside that 10-second pause, power had quietly redefined itself, not as volume, but as vision, not as dominance, but as dignity. And as the clip played on loop across timelines and broadcasts, millions understood, perhaps for the first time in a long while, that silence, when paired with truth, can still move a nation. Inside the hearing chamber, a low murmur replaced the earlier silence. The atmosphere felt subtly altered, as though everyone present had witnessed not a clash, but a calibration of what public dialogue could be. Committee members leaned toward one another, trading restrained remarks. Some scribbled notes with renewed purpose. Others simply stared at the empty space between Crockett and Dershowitz, still absorbing the gravity of what had unfolded there. The moderator, regaining composure, thanked both participants and moved to close the session. Yet his tone, softer, more deliberate, betrayed an unspoken awareness that something transcendent had occurred. What began as an academic inquiry into constitutional principles had, by its end, become a meditation on justice itself, on how ideas shape the people they are meant to protect. As cameras powered down, aides shuffled papers with quiet efficiency, but the usual post-hearing chatter was missing. The hum of politics had been replaced by reflection. Even the security officers by the doors seemed slower in their movements, like the air itself had grown heavier with meaning. Outside the chamber, the story was already rewriting itself in real time. Reporters dashed to deliver updates. Within minutes, social feeds began filling with clips marked by timestamps. 11:42, the moment of the pause. Headlines multiplied. When intellect met integrity. The question that stopped the room. Crockett versus Dershowitz, a lesson in listening. The footage spread faster than expected. On major platforms, viewers replayed the 10-second pause, dissecting every angle. Crockett's calm, Dershowitz's hesitation, the quiet respect that followed. In an age of outrage and viral confrontation, this moment stood apart. Not because someone was humiliated, but because restraint itself had gone viral. Comment threads reflected that rare shift in tone. One user wrote, "This isn't a takedown. It's what accountability looks like when it grows up." Another replied, "I don't agree with her politics, but I respect how she held her ground without turning cruel." There were defenders on both sides, critics on both sides, but beneath it all, a common thread of admiration for civility. News outlets replayed excerpts through the afternoon. Analysts parsed legal points while ethicists discussed rhetorical grace. Cable networks ran split-screen segments. On one side, Crockett's poised question. On the other, Dershowitz's thoughtful, delayed reply. Commentators described it as a masterclass in civic dialogue. When asked for comment, Crockett's team issued a simple statement. Questions matter because truth matters. No victory lap, no partisan framing. Just the moral clarity of inquiry itself. The line trended for hours, not because it was clever, but because it was clean. Dershowitz, too, spoke later that evening in an interview. "It was a necessary challenge," he said. A moment that reminds us why democracy must always be willing to test itself. His tone carried neither defensiveness nor defeat, only reflection. It was, in many ways, the perfect complement to Crockett's restraint, the mutual acknowledgement that dialogue, not dominance, was the true measure of progress. Their responses became the next layer of the story. Editorials described it as a rare instance of public disagreement that strengthened public trust. Commentators observed that both participants had modeled something profoundly missing from modern discourse: the ability to disagree without destruction. Beyond the headlines, though, something deeper had begun to stir. In classrooms, students replayed the clip as a study in persuasion and ethics. Professors discussed how Crockett's question bridged moral philosophy and constitutional law. Community organizers shared it in workshops on civic leadership. Even late-night talk shows, usually hungry for sound bites, approached the moment with uncharacteristic sincerity. Meanwhile, online debates unfolded with surprising nuance. Viewers didn't just argue about who was right. They reflected on why the question mattered. Some wrote essays on the role of conscience in governance. Others posted long threads about empathy and public service. For a fleeting moment, social media, so often the arena of division, became a forum for collective introspection. Inside Crockett's office, her aides monitored the reaction quietly. There was no celebration, no press tour scheduled. "It's not about going viral," one of them remarked. "It's about what it made people think about." Crockett agreed, replying only, "If people are thinking, then it was worth asking." By nightfall, the clip had surpassed 1 million views. Commentators began calling it the pause that echoed. And yet beneath the trending tags and polished headlines, the essence remained startlingly pure. A hearing that had begun with formality and expectation had ended with something rarer: a glimpse of what truth looks like when it doesn't need to shout. As the day closed and lights dimmed across the Capitol, the echo of that exchange lingered, not as noise, but as memory. A reminder that the real aftermath of courage isn't chaos or applause. It's the quiet recalibration of what we expect from those who speak in the public's name. Because when intellect meets integrity, the world doesn't just listen, it remembers. Within days, the moment had evolved from a viral clip into a case study. Major newspapers ran front-page features dissecting the exchange. Academic journals began drafting op-eds titled "When Law Meets Conscience." Law professors assigned the hearing as required viewing in ethics and constitutional seminars. In one university lecture hall, a professor paused midway through the video and asked her students, "What makes this question powerful isn't its sharpness, it's its sincerity." The room fell silent, mirroring the moment that had captivated millions. Across campuses, student forums replayed the clip on projectors, discussing tone, composure, and the anatomy of truth in public discourse. For once, political engagement felt less about taking sides and more about understanding principles. The conversation transcended ideology. It became a meditation on accountability itself, how power should respond when confronted not with outrage, but with moral clarity. Commentators from both conservative and progressive outlets, often at odds, found rare common ground. "This wasn't a takedown," one wrote. "It was a turning point." Another described it as intellectual accountability on display. The public, weary of endless partisan theatrics, seemed hungry for exactly that. Viewers who had tuned in expecting fireworks found something subtler but more enduring: the quiet force of integrity. The exchange reshaped expectations for what congressional hearings could represent. No longer just arenas for grandstanding or political optics, they could, at their best, become classrooms for the nation, places where ideas, not egos, take center stage. Legislators, journalists, and commentators began citing the moment as a model of substance over spectacle. On social platforms, a different kind of discourse took hold. Users began sharing timestamps not for outrage, but for reflection. "Watch 1142, one caption read, "and remember what calm conviction looks like." Threads followed where strangers discussed empathy, civic duty, and the ethics of advocacy. The algorithms, so often fueled by conflict, were momentarily repurposed by curiosity and respect. In political circles, the exchange reignited a larger conversation about representation, about how public servants could challenge, question, and persuade without demeaning. A quiet consensus emerged among observers that civility need not dilute conviction. Moral persuasion and respect, one editorial wrote, are not opposites. They are allies. Within Congress, the ripple spread. Younger lawmakers cited Crockett's composure as an example of modern advocacy, firm but humane. "She didn't shout," one representative remarked. "She listened, and that's why she was heard." Meanwhile, seasoned figures like Dershowitz were credited for meeting the challenge with openness rather than defensiveness, a gesture of intellectual humility that elevated the exchange beyond rivalry. It marked, many said, a generational inflection point. Younger leaders like Crockett were redefining debate through emotional intelligence, a blend of empathy and analytical precision. In contrast, veteran voices like Dershowitz represented a lineage of logic and tradition. The beauty of the moment was not in their difference, but in their dialogue, the coexistence of legacy and evolution. Together, they embodied the tension at the heart of democracy, the constant recalibration between principle and progress. Think tanks, civic organizations, and nonprofits seized the opportunity. Panels titled "The Ethics of Power and the Power of Ethics" emerged across institutions. Legal symposiums explored whether justice should be viewed solely as a system of rules or also as a moral practice. The Crockett-Dershowitz exchange, one panelist noted, wasn't about law versus conscience. It was about law rediscovering its conscience. In classrooms, the clip replaced old examples of courtroom drama as a study in persuasion. Teachers asked students to analyze tone over tactics, presence over performance. Many remarked that the moment rekindled their faith in the purpose of civic dialogue, that politics, when stripped of theater, could still teach. Even late-night programs and satirical hosts treated the event with reverence. Jokes gave way to admiration. One host ended his segment saying, "Maybe this is what winning looks like, when neither side loses their humanity." For the broader public, the moment functioned like a mirror. It reflected back a yearning for something deeper than sound bites, a politics anchored in conscience. Citizens across backgrounds began sharing the clip with captions like, "This is what we should expect from leadership." In an era of cynicism, one simple exchange managed to spark civic optimism. As days turned into weeks, the clip's influence didn't fade. It matured. It became reference material for podcasts, sermons, and university panels. Journalists called it a reset moment for democratic conversation. For once, the discourse wasn't about outrage or scandal. It was about values, how they sound, how they feel, and how they survive under scrutiny. And beneath all the analysis, one truth lingered, that the most powerful silence is the one that follows honesty. Because sometimes democracy doesn't roar, it listens. And in that brief, breathtaking pause between question and answer, a nation remembered what justice can still sound like when spoken with grace. History rarely preserves the noise of politics, the shouting, the spin, the performative victories that dominate headlines for a week and vanish the next. What endures are the moments when principle outlasts pride. Jasmine Crockett's question will be remembered not because it unsettled a scholar, but because it revived a question the nation keeps avoiding. What is justice without empathy? That single inquiry cut through layers of legal theory and political posture to reach something elemental, the conscience of governance itself. In that instant, she didn't just challenge a man of law, she summoned the spirit of democracy. The silence that followed became its own kind of testimony, proof that truth, when spoken without malice, still carries authority. The exchange stands now as a symbol of democratic health, a living reminder that disagreement need not divide. When dialogue remains grounded in respect, even the sharpest contrasts of thought can refine understanding rather than destroy it. Crockett and Dershowitz, in their very differences, modeled what civic maturity looks like, the rare art of conversation that expands, rather than erodes, the space between perspectives. For students of law, that moment offers a lesson more enduring than any precedent. Facts may persuade minds, but integrity persuades history. The courtroom and the chamber may evolve, but the moral currency of sincerity never devalues. The courage to question, to hold power accountable without dehumanizing it, remains the foundation upon which every true reform is built. For citizens, it served as a quiet reawakening. In an era when cynicism often passes for wisdom, the hearing reminded viewers that engagement is not naivety, it is stewardship. To question authority is not to rebel against democracy, it is to participate in its preservation. And for those who watched that brief pause, the breath between intellect and humility, something deeper stirred. The moment revealed that truth does not need theatrics or volume to matter. It needs courage. It needs composure. It needs someone willing to speak not to win, but to awaken. In time, the headlines will fade, as they always do. But the echo of that exchange, the calm question, the thoughtful silence, the mutual recognition, will remain. It will live on as a reminder that justice, at its best, is not merely a structure of laws, but a state of heart. Because when empathy enters the equation, justice stops being an argument and becomes an act of humanity. Moments like this remind us that democracy's strength has never rested in volume, but in the quiet discipline of listening. What unfolded between Jasmine Crockett and Alan Dershowitz wasn't a victory of one mind over another. It was a victory of principle over pride. She didn't defeat him. She dignified the debate, proving that respect and conviction can coexist without compromise. If you believe that truth and empathy still deserve space in our public conversations, stay connected. Subscribe, share, and keep watching stories that remind us why reasoned courage matters. Because every time truth speaks without shouting, every time integrity holds its ground, and every time power pauses long enough to listen, democracy breathes a little easier.